I found out my brother had been opening credit cards in our dead parents' names for 6 years when a collections agency called me, our mother's listed emergency contact, about an unpaid balance racked up 8 months after she died. My name is Delphine Vance, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. Our parents died within 11 months of each other, our father from a heart attack and our mother from complications following a stroke she never fully recovered from, leaving my brother Thaddeus and me to handle their modest estate together. I lived out of state and trusted Thaddeus, who lived nearby, to handle the practical logistics of closing accounts and notifying creditors, since I was drowning in my own grief and grateful someone competent was managing the paperwork I could barely look at. I need to slow the story down here, because the bare facts make it sound cleaner than it felt while I was living it. Nothing about discovering my brother used our deceased parents' identity to open credit cards for years arrived as one neat dramatic revelation. It came in fragments, a sentence that did not belong, a date that sat wrong in my memory, a document that used familiar names in unfamiliar ways, and then the awful quiet after I realized I had to keep functioning normally while my private life was being quietly rewritten in front of me. The collections call came 6 years after our mother's death, informing me that a credit card in her name had an outstanding balance of over $4,000, with charges dating as recently as 3 months earlier. I told the representative firmly that this had to be identity theft, since my mother had been deceased for 6 years, and she should not have any active accounts at all. The representative paused, then told me, almost apologetically, that the account had actually been opened 8 months after my mother's date of death, using her social security number and a mailing address that matched, according to their records, my brother Thaddeus's own home. The first thing I did was make myself a timeline. I wrote down every date I could verify, every conversation I remembered, every amount of money or account number or message that might matter later. That sounds practical because it was, but it was also a way to keep myself from spiraling. When someone you trust turns reality into something slippery, paper becomes a railing. I needed dates, names, receipts, and screenshots because my feelings were too loud to be useful by themselves. What hurt most in those first days was not only the act itself, it was the way ordinary memories began changing shape. Dinners, errands, family calls, little jokes in the kitchen, conversations I had replayed fondly for years suddenly had a shadow under them. I kept wondering what the person I trusted had known during those moments, what had already been in motion, and whether I had been the only person in the room living honestly. I did not call Thaddeus that day. I hung up with the collections representative, sat at my kitchen table for a long time, and told myself there had to be an innocent explanation, some clerical mix-up involving his address that had nothing to do with him personally, even as a colder, more honest part of me already suspected otherwise. I decided to pull our mother's and father's full credit reports myself before saying anything, using my legal standing as executor of both their estates to request the records directly from all 3 credit bureaus, since I needed to understand the actual scope of whatever this was before I said a single accusatory word to my own brother. I learned quickly that betrayal has an administrative side nobody warns you about. There are passwords to change, statements to download, records to request, calls to make during business hours, and professionals who need clean copies rather than emotional summaries. I would be shaking after a discovery, then 10 minutes later I would be on hold listening to cheerful music while waiting for someone to confirm a date connected to credit cards. What came back within 2 weeks was far more extensive than one collections call had suggested. Both of our parents had multiple credit accounts opened in the years since their deaths, 7 cards total across both of their identities, spanning nearly the entire 6 years since our mother passed, with a combined total of just over $31,000 in charges and unpaid balances. Every account listed the same mailing address, Thaddeus's home. The people who helped me, especially Priscilla, Cornelius, Delphine, kept reminding me to separate suspicion from proof. Suspicion told me where to look. Proof was what would protect me when the story got ugly. That distinction mattered because the person I trusted had already shown a willingness to shape facts around convenience, and I could not afford to hand over my anger as the only evidence I had. So I built folders, one for credit cards, one for parents' identities, one for messages, one for statements, one for anything that connected the timeline. I named files boring things like transfer confirmation and call notes because I wanted the record to be usable by someone who had not lived inside my panic. Every time I saved another document, I felt both steadier and sadder. I called an attorney, Priscilla Nakamura, who specialized in estate and identity fraud matters, and explained everything, including my growing certainty that Thaddeus had been doing this deliberately rather than through some accidental mix-up. She told me that continued use of a deceased person's identity to open credit constitutes identity theft regardless of family relationship, and that as executor, I had both standing and, arguably, an obligation to investigate fully before the estates could be properly closed, since these accounts represented ongoing liability exposure even years after our parents' deaths. She recommended a forensic accountant, Cornelius Akubi, to trace exactly how the accounts had been used and to what purpose the money had actually gone. There were several nights when I almost confronted the person I trusted before I was ready. I would look across the room and feel the words pressing against my teeth. But I had already seen enough to understand that an early confrontation would give the person I trusted time to explain away, delete, reframe, or blame me for misunderstanding. Waiting was not weakness. Waiting was strategy, even when it felt like swallowing glass. Cornelius spent 4 weeks tracing 6 years of spending across all 7 accounts and found that the charges weren't random or impulsive, but concentrated heavily on recurring expenses. Mortgage-adjacent home equity line payments on Thaddeus's own house, his children's private school tuition during 2 specific years, when Cornelius's records showed Thaddeus's own income had dipped due to a job change, and a pattern of cash advances timed suspiciously close to gambling transactions. Cornelius found on Thaddeus's personal accounts during the same windows. Thaddeus had essentially been using our dead parents' credit as a personal financial safety net for 6 years, making minimum payments just often enough to avoid the accounts being flagged for fraud by the banks themselves, until the balances finally grew large enough that a collections agency escalated one account to me directly. During that waiting period, I became aware of tiny performances in my own home and work life. I answered normal questions, I made normal meals. I replied to messages with ordinary punctuation. I laughed at things that were only mildly funny because I did not want anyone studying my face too closely. Meanwhile, behind that normal surface, I was checking dates and gathering records connected to mail forwarding. One of the strangest parts was how calm I sounded to other people. When I called offices, banks, administrators, clerks, or attorneys, my voice became almost too polite. I had learned that panic makes people cautious, but calm makes them useful. I would thank someone for confirming a number, hang up, and then sit on the edge of my bed with my hands over my mouth because that number meant my life was even less honest than I had hoped. The 4 weeks between the collections call and Cornelius's completed reconstruction were quietly excruciating since Thaddeus called me twice during that stretch, once about a minor estate tax question and once just to check in, entirely unaware that I'd already pulled our parents' full credit reports and hired both an attorney and a forensic accountant. I answered both calls warmly, gave no indication anything had changed, and hung up each time feeling a specific, hollow dishonesty I'd never experienced with my own brother before. Priscilla had warned me that confronting him before Cornelius's reconstruction was complete risked him quickly closing accounts, altering records, or preparing a rehearsed explanation that might make 6 years of deliberate use look like an isolated lapse in judgment. Waiting those 4 weeks meant that by the time I finally sat across from him, there were 7 documented accounts, a spending pattern spanning 6 years, and no room left for him to frame it as anything smaller than what it actually was. The documentation changed my grief. At first I was grieving what I suspected. Then I was grieving what I could prove. That second grief was heavier because it removed the last little place where denial could hide. I could no longer tell myself there had been a misunderstanding, a mistake, or one impulsive decision. The record showed a pattern, and patterns are harder to forgive than accidents. I confronted Thaddeus at his house, with Priscilla's summary and Cornelius's full spending reconstruction in hand. He tried, at first, to frame it as a temporary measure he'd fully intended to unwind once his finances stabilized, insisting he'd never meant for it to stretch across 6 years. But when I pointed out that he'd opened new accounts as recently as 8 months earlier, well past any reasonable definition of temporary, he stopped offering explanations and simply admitted he'd let it become easier than confronting his own financial problems directly, especially once he realized how rarely anyone checks a dead person's credit report. I also had to confront my own embarrassment. I hated that I had not noticed sooner. I hated that I could look back and see moments when the truth had brushed past me and I had explained it away, because trust made the innocent explanation feel more reasonable. But every professional I spoke to told me the same thing. People who deceive successfully do it by exploiting normal trust, not by leaving obvious clues on the table. That sentence helped me more than I expected. It reminded me that I had not failed some imaginary test of intelligence. I had loved, trusted, collaborated, or relied on someone who understood exactly which parts of my life were too ordinary for me to question. That is not stupidity. That is the specific cruelty of being deceived by someone close enough to know where your guard naturally rests. Priscilla helped me formally close every fraudulent account and dispute the outstanding balances with all three credit bureaus, using our parents' death certificates and Cornelius's documentation to establish the accounts as posthumous identity theft rather than legitimate estate debt, which relieved the estates, and by extension me as a residual beneficiary, of any liability for the $31,000 in charges. Whether to pursue criminal charges against my own brother was a decision I sat with for weeks, ultimately deciding, with Priscilla's guidance, to pursue a civil restitution agreement rather than a criminal referral, requiring Thaddeus to repay the full amount directly to me over 3 years in exchange for my agreement not to file a police report, a compromise that felt like the only way to hold him accountable without destroying what little remained of our relationship as the last two people who remembered our parents. By the time the evidence around fraud affidavits was clear, I had stopped thinking in terms of one confrontation and started thinking in terms of containment. I needed to protect money, records, family, reputation, housing, work, or legal standing before any emotional conversation happened. My first responsibility was no longer getting an explanation. My first responsibility was making sure the damage did not spread. Cornelius told me once his part of the case closed that posthumous identity theft by family members is far more common than people assume, precisely because credit monitoring for deceased individuals is far less rigorous than for the living, and because family members handling an estate's logistics are uniquely positioned to intercept mail, redirect notifications, and answer verification questions that would stop a stranger cold. He said the detail that troubled him most in my case wasn't the dollar amount, which was modest compared to some fraud cases he'd worked, but the 6-year duration, since it meant Thaddeus had built an entire quiet financial habit around exploiting two people who could never once ask him to stop. That shift made me colder than I recognized. I was not cruel, exactly, but I became very precise. I asked questions in complete sentences. I wrote down answers as soon as I got them. I did not accept verbal reassurance when a document could verify the truth. I began to understand why people in crisis sometimes look detached from the outside. Detachment was the only thing letting me move. I remember one morning in particular when I woke up before sunrise and checked the evidence folder before I checked my messages. It had become the center of gravity. Each file inside it represented something I had not wanted to know, but also something I could now act on. There was power in that, even if it was a miserable kind of power. Priscilla told me something similar, that these cases are rarely about a single moment of desperation, but about how easy it becomes to keep doing something once the first year passes without consequence. I think about our parents often now, not just with grief, but with a strange, specific anger on their behalf, imagining how they would have felt knowing their names were still being used, still generating debt, years after they were gone, by the one person they trusted to handle everything once they no longer could. Thaddeus and I still speak, carefully, mostly about logistics related to the repayment agreement, and I don't know if our relationship will ever feel the way it did before that collections call, when I still believed both of us were equally protecting what our parents left behind. The closer I got to confronting the person I trusted, the more I thought about the version of myself from before. That earlier version had made plans without accounting for deception. She had believed promises, assumed good faith, and organized her future around people behaving like the people they claimed to be. I felt protective of her, and angry on her behalf, in a way I could not explain to anyone without sounding like I was talking about another person. When the confrontation finally came, it did not feel cinematic. It felt fluorescent and practical. There were papers on a table, a glass of water I barely touched, and a silence that lasted just a little too long after the first document appeared. That silence told me the person I trusted recognized the evidence before any confession did. Denial came first, because denial almost always comes first. Then came narrowing. Then came context. Then came the attempt to make the worst part sound like an unfortunate misunderstanding. I had prepared myself for anger, but what surprised me was the exhaustion. Listening to someone rearrange the obvious into something softer is tiring in a way that goes deep into the body. I kept bringing the conversation back to facts, not feelings, not theories, not what the person I trusted meant to do, not whether I had been too sensitive, not whether anyone had been under pressure. Facts, dates, amounts, forms, messages, records. The reason I could do that was because I had waited long enough to gather the evidence connected to credit bureaus. At several points, the person I trusted tried to make the conversation about my reaction rather than the behavior itself. That is a common little escape hatch. If they can make you defend your tone, your timing, your suspicion, or your decision to investigate, then the original betrayal has to share the stage. I refused that stage. My reaction was not the emergency. The deception was. What I wanted, in some childish corner of myself, was a sentence that could make everything hurt less. I wanted the person I trusted to say something so honest and complete that it would at least restore my faith in the person behind the damage. What I got instead was partial accountability mixed with self-pity, and I had to accept that remorse can be real without being sufficient. The aftermath was not one clean break either. It was weeks of notices, calls, corrections, follow-up records, and small discoveries that kept arriving after I thought I understood the whole picture. Betrayal rarely ends at the confrontation. The confrontation is just the point where everyone stops pretending the old story is still usable. People around me wanted simple updates. They asked whether I was okay, whether things had been resolved, whether the person I trusted had apologized, whether the legal or financial side was settled. I understood why they asked like that, but simple answers felt impossible. I could be relieved and devastated in the same hour. I could be proud of myself and still embarrassed. I could be certain I had done the right thing and still miss the life I thought I had. I also learned how uneven support can be. Some people understood immediately. Some people wanted me to move faster toward forgiveness because discomfort makes observers impatient. A few people seemed more interested in the dramatic details than in the practical damage. I became selective about what I shared, not because I was hiding the truth, but because not everyone deserved access to the rawest version of it. The practical recovery required routines. I made checklists. I confirmed balances. I changed contact information. I requested written confirmations. I kept copies of every letter. Those tasks were not glamorous, but they were the steps that rebuilt the floor under me. Healing, at least at first, looked less like insight and more like not missing a deadline. There were moments when I was tempted to measure justice only by whether the person I trusted suffered enough. I understand that impulse now, but it was not where I wanted to live. What I needed most was repair, records corrected, money returned where possible, access removed, lies documented, and future damage prevented. Consequences mattered, but revenge could not be the architecture of my recovery. The legal and administrative process forced me to become fluent in parts of life I had never wanted to study. I learned the difference between authorization and liability, between suspicion and admissible evidence, between a verbal promise and a binding written commitment. I learned how quickly people who betrayed you can become careful once they realize you are no longer relying on trust alone. I thought a lot about consent during that period, not just romantic consent, but financial, legal, professional, and familial consent. So much of what happened depended on someone assuming they could use my name, my trust, my future, my silence, or my emotional attachment without asking. Naming that helped me understand why the betrayal felt so invasive. It was not only about what was taken, it was about the decision that I did not need to be asked. The hardest conversations were the ones with people indirectly affected. Explaining enough without making the story more confusing. Protecting privacy while refusing to protect lies. Choosing words carefully because anger can be true and still not be the only truth someone else needs to hear. Those conversations stretched me in ways the documents never could. I kept returning to the timeline whenever memory tried to soften things. That may sound unforgiving, but it was necessary. When you have loved or trusted someone, your mind keeps offering exits for them. Maybe it was pressure, maybe it was fear, maybe it was one bad choice. The timeline answered quietly, no, this was repeated, this was maintained, this required decisions. At the same time, I did not want the betrayal to become the only story about me. For a while it tried to. Every errand, every call, every quiet moment seemed to orbit what had happened. Eventually I began forcing other things back into my days. Work, walks, meals with people who did not ask for every update, small plans that belonged entirely to me. One detail that stayed with me was how ordinary the evidence looked. A line on a statement, a name in a record, a date in a filing, a form with a signature. None of it looked like heartbreak. That disconnect made me understand how much of adult disaster arrives, disguised as paperwork. I became more careful after this, but I did not want to become permanently suspicious of everyone. That balance took time. I wanted better safeguards, not a smaller life. I wanted verification where verification mattered, but I did not want the person I trusted to teach me that trust itself was foolish. The lesson was more specific than that. Trust should not require blindness. When the immediate crisis passed, I had to deal with the delayed emotion. During the investigation and confrontation, there had always been a next task. Once the task slowed down, the grief caught up. I would be doing something harmless, folding laundry or making coffee, and suddenly remember one tiny lie that had supported a larger one, and the room would tilt for a few seconds. Therapy helped, but not because it made the story nicer. It helped me stop arguing with what had already happened. I had spent so much energy trying to understand how the person I trusted could do it that I had neglected the more important question of what I needed now that it had been done. Understanding motive was not the same as rebuilding safety. Financially and legally, I came out steadier than I feared, because I moved carefully early. Emotionally, the outcome was more complicated. There is no settlement that refunds the version of time you thought you were living. There is no signed agreement that returns the easy confidence you had before you knew how thoroughly someone could use it. Still, there were real victories. Records were corrected. Responsibility was documented. People who needed to know the truth learned it. Access that should never have existed was removed. The story no longer depended on the person I trusted's version of events. That mattered more than I can fully explain. If there is one thing I wish I had understood sooner, it is that calm action is not the same as not being hurt. I was deeply hurt. I was also organized. Those two facts existed together. The organization did not cancel the pain. It gave the pain somewhere useful to go until I could feel it safely. I have replayed the confrontation many times, wondering whether I should have said something sharper, colder, more devastating. But the older I get, the more I value the fact that I stayed anchored. I did not need the perfect line. I needed the truth on the table and a path out of the damage. I got both. The relationship I had with the person I trusted did not survive in the form it had existed before. In some cases, no relationship should survive that kind of deception. In others, what remains has to be rebuilt under conditions so different that it feels like a new structure entirely. Either way, the old trust was not misplaced back onto the shelf as though nothing had happened. I also stopped apologizing for documenting things. Before this, I sometimes worried that asking for written confirmation sounded distrustful. Now I see it differently. Clear records are not an insult to honest people. Honest people benefit from clarity too. The only people who resent documentation are often the ones who preferred confusion. There is a particular loneliness in realizing someone close to you had a private plan for your life that you were never invited to approve. That was the core of it for me. Whether the issue was money, family, work, identity, or marriage, the real wound was being treated as an obstacle to manage instead of a person with a right to know. I rebuilt my sense of judgment slowly. At first, every decision felt suspect because I had been wrong about something important. But being deceived does not mean every instinct was broken. It means someone supplied false information to a system that was otherwise trying to work. My judgment improved when I gave it better data. The people who stood by me did not always have brilliant advice. Most of the time, they had presence. They answered the phone. They sat with me while I sorted files. They reminded me to eat before difficult calls. They treated my reality as real without demanding that I perform strength for them. That kind of support is quieter than drama and far more useful. Eventually, I noticed that the story no longer flooded every corner of the day. It still mattered, but it stopped being the only thing that mattered. That was the first sign of real recovery, not forgiveness necessarily, not forgetting, just the return of proportion. I keep the final file stored somewhere safe, not because I want to reread it often, but because I never again want to depend on memory alone for a truth someone else once tried to blur. The documents are not my life, but they are a record of the moment I stopped letting someone else narrate it for me. What I know now is that betrayal is not only discovered, it is investigated, survived, and slowly outlived. The discovery is the loud part. The survival is quiet. It happens in calls made, forms filed, and the morning you wake up and realize the truth did not destroy you after all.